Hello, everybody. Welcome back to A Push, AP US History. Now, we're still in Unit 1, but we're moving on to a third chapter in this particular set of lessons. Now, we're going to move away from talking about the individual regions of British colonization and talking a little bit about some of the shared aspects between the regions of English colonization. First, though, with a little bit about culture and philosophy. In our next chapter, we're going to explore a little bit about the nature of the relationship with England and some of the economic characteristics and related to that, political characteristics of the relationship between England and its colonies. So let's take a look at some of the ideas of culture, especially ideas revolving around religion. Remember, as usual, these videos are going to be fairly short summaries of things that we cover in class. Obviously, I would consult with other peers about the content that we discuss in class if you're ever absent, but these videos are designed as a little bit of a refresher and as a kind of highlighting of the most important concepts. This is serving as one way of communicating information to you, the students. Anyway, before we get started with the timer that I will set on my phone momentarily, let's take a look at the lesson topics. Well, the lesson topics are a bit more straightforward. First, we'll take a look at colonial culture. We'll take a look a little bit about colonial society, anything that we haven't talked about so far. But we'll also take a look at some of the philosophy, actually, going into ideas that will become important in the American Revolution, especially in the form of the Enlightenment. All right. Now, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start this timer. I'm going to put a timer on for 20 minutes, 20 Minuten, and I'm going to press play. One, two, wait, no, three, two, one, go. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing that we are going to talk about is something that you know a lot about, something called the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment emerged in Europe first. It emerged in places like France and England with guys like Voltaire and Montesquieu and John Locke, for example. However, as we are going to see, the ideas of the Enlightenment are extremely important in the development of what becomes the American Revolution. Because while it starts in Europe, the Enlightenment, it is going to transfer over to the New World. And we'll look at some of the ways that it does. But what is the Enlightenment? Well, the Enlightenment is a time period in Western history, aka Western Europe and North American history, in which we see there is a lot of advancement in terms of philosophy concerning society and concerning politics. Now, some of the most important ideas of the Enlightenment are as follows. They include things like a big emphasis on reason. We see that Enlightenment philosophers tended to really reject religion. They tended to reject religion in favor of secularism. Kind of the focus on reason, on needing to prove something is true through observation, through logic, through facts and evidence. These things are the basis of philosophy in the Enlightenment. This kind of big focus on truth. Now, as I just mentioned, a lot of this truth is going to come through scientific means. Kind of one of the big antecedents, or that's not the right word, predecessors to the Enlightenment is the scientific revolution, which you learned about last year in both your sophomore history classes. Now, kind of that is going to help explain a little bit of the politics of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment political philosophers tended to emphasize secularism. We should base a government on the general will of the people, on the idea of constitutionalism, rather than simply ideas like divine right monarchy, that God's like, you get to rule because you're the best dude ever. I chose you to rule on my behalf over the rest of the world. Now, kind of one example of Enlightenment ideas of secularism is the concept of deism. Deism is a kind of blending of Enlightenment values with Christianity. A lot of the founding fathers and a lot of the Enlightenment believers were deists. Deists are people who believe that God exists, God created the universe, but he governs this universe through fundamental scientific natural laws. Things like physics, things like chemistry, things like gravity, which I guess is a part of physics, but whatever. So these scientific laws, they are what govern the universe. God's like a watchmaker. He set in motion a perfect universe that runs pretty much by itself. Kind of secular deists, they tend to de-emphasize the direct role of God in everyday people's lives. Now, this is pretty radical for the time period because of the big focus on religion that you might have learned about in the Middle Ages or in the early modern period in places like France and Spain, for example. Now, in terms of the political side of the Enlightenment, not only is there this emphasis on secularism, but there's also this emphasis on the idea of constitutionalism. Kind of, we want to organize society in a logical, straightforward, and rational manner. It makes more sense to list out the rules and rights of citizens in a single document than to just kind of base it on religion, to base it off on the whims of the political leader at the time. So many, but not all, Enlightenment thinkers tended to embrace constitutionalism, especially guys like the Baron de Montesquieu. I am going to write his name down, and I'm going to misspell it because I don't know how to spell it. Montesquieu. That's not how you spell that. Let's see what autocorrect does. Gosh darn, it doesn't do it. All right, hold the freak on, brothers and sisters. All right. Baron de Montesquieu. Okay. Copy. Where am I going? There we go. I totally misspelt that. Okay, come on. Why does God hate me? So ignore that first one right there. That's how you spell Baron de Montesquieu. Okay. I was close. Yeah, it was really close, except there's like a 50 billion eyes in there, but whatever. French isn't real. Anyway, let's get back to the main matter at hand. So, kind of, we see that philosophers like the Baron de Montesquieu, they believe in this idea of three branches of government. Whoa, I wonder if that's going to come up again in the future. There's also political philosophers like Rousseau, for example. Rousseau believes in this idea of democracy. Well, you could interpret a lot of Rousseau's views as being democratic. He realized that government should only get its consent from the general will of the population. But probably the most important Enlightenment philosopher, especially in the English Enlightenment and subsequently the American Enlightenment, is going to be the figure of John Locke. Now, John Locke is important in our story because of his big emphasis on the rights of citizens. Natural rights is the big concept to associate with Mr. John Locke. John Locke argued that every government had a responsibility to its subjects to provide or protect, I should say, basic God-given rights. In other words, you could almost say that John Locke was articulating something like this, that it is a self-evident truth that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, which among these include life, liberty, and, according to John Locke, property. Kind of the insistence that property is a value is something that is a natural right that cannot be taken away without the consent of the governed. That's a crucial part of the Enlightenment's political implications. Keep that pinned in the back of your mind for the rest of this unit and definitely for the next and for the next unit as well. The idea of natural rights, that citizens have rights to property and that property cannot be confiscated without the consent of the governed. Now, in addition, John Locke is also going to theorize that if government ever becomes destructive of these ends, meaning the natural rights, it is the right and responsibility of the people to overthrow or alter that government to create a government that actually respects those basic natural rights. And the reason why this is so important is that actually I was partially quoting slash paraphrasing the American Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's a big old plagiarist. He, among other things, but he's also, he kind of is borrowing directly from these Enlightenment thinkers from the early 1700s and the late 1600s. So kind of The reason why this is important is because the Enlightenment does provide the philosophical and political justification for eventual independence. And a lot of American colonists seize on these ideas because of their own local governments that have constitutions, that respect basic natural rights. And a lot of the people who came to the New World, they came to make money, to gain property. Property rights is a very distinctly American kind of focus that is more accessible. There's a lot of land here that Native Americans live on, let's be honest, but that land is going to be, in the eyes of the English, seized, taken away, and settled properly, quote unquote, by the English settlers themselves. Never mind. All right. Now, in terms of kind of some of the big figures in the American Enlightenment, we'll talk about Thomas Jefferson more in our next unit. But kind of one of the big figures to associate with the American Enlightenment is this boy right here, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, besides just being a straight up playa, he is going to be a major figure in the American Enlightenment because of his focus on secularism, on reason. He's a deist in his early life, actually, Mr. Benjamin Franklin right here. And the kind of political system that he will help create. He's one of the kind of co-authors of the Declaration of Independence. He's one of the big advisors to the creation of the Constitution. It does derive from a secular tradition from figures like Mr. Benjamin Franklin. All right. Now, enough about the Enlightenment. Let's move over to something that's, well, completely different. To quote Monty Python, we're going to look at the First Great Awakening. Now, the First Great Awakening is kind of the opposite in some ways from the Enlightenment. Whereas the Enlightenment was all about secularism, the First Great Awakening is going to be religious in nature. And we especially see that in just the basic definition of what the First Great Awakening was. The First Great Awakening is a revival, a renewed interest in evangelical Protestant Christianity. It's kind of a pushback against a lot of different factors. For one thing, it's a pushback against the strictness of the Puritans, and it's a pushback against the Enlightenment itself. The Enlightenment was secular. There's this fear among some evangelical Protestants that America is, or the colonies, I should say, are losing their religious nature. And we need to return the flock back to the shepherd, back to the holy arms of various Christian denominations. Now, what are some of the characteristics of this First Great Awakening? Just like we saw with the Enlightenment, there are some things that help define this very religious movement. The reason why we're talking about this at all, as we'll indicate later, is that the First Great Awakening really helps contribute to dividing and making a separate American colonial identity that's not like what the English have. Kind of culturally, the First Great Awakening helps explain the difference, the separation between England and its colonies in the New World. And kind of one of the things that defines the American colonies, and definitely will help define the future United States, is the big importance of religion, especially Protestant Christianity. Now, speaking of which, what are some of the beliefs that are common in this First Great Awakening? Well, for one thing, the First Great Awakening really emphasizes emotion in Christianity, emotion in religion, of trying to create a direct personal connection with the big guy upstairs, with Mr. God himself. So, a real big focus on singing hymns, a real big focus on very fiery and passionate sermons that move the audience, that move the attendance in church. Oftentimes, these services are so intense, people cry, they weep, they openly scream at the fear of going to hell. But the other kind of big focus of the First Great Awakening is kind of realizing that church membership prior to the 1730s is at an all-time low. We need to bring people back. We need to make them feel welcome in the form of focusing on the forgiveness of sins. You might sin in the past. You might have sinned in the past. But if you repent, if you appeal back to the good church, you can be saved. So kind of that idea of forgiveness of sins by establishing a direct emotional connection with God. But the First Great Awakening is also kind of a rejection of the Puritans in a way. They reject especially the concept of predestination. You are not determined to go to heaven or hell. you can change that fact. You can either become a really bad person and go to hell, or you can become a really good person and go to heaven. So there is this kind of religious divide that is emerging between the practicers of the First Great Awakening with kind of the older vision of Christianity, which we'll talk about later. Now, the other thing that defines the First Great Awakening is going to be this focus on evangelism. Evangelism is a fancy dancy word that we'll use from every now and then. That basically means it is your job as a good boy Christian to spread the faith as much as possible. One of the big characteristics of the First Great Awakening are massive traveling minister or the ministers aren't massive themselves, but traveling ministers and massive crowds of people listening to the sermon. And kind of an example of that actually is going to be what happens in the American First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening is mostly an American phenomenon, but there are some examples of traveling English preachers. For example, this guy named George Whitefield. Now, you don't really need to know that much about George Whitefield, but the figure that you would need to know more about is a fire and brimstone preacher, 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 preacher. But there are things that the homilies and hymns won't teach you, teacher. Anyway, it's this guy right here, Mr. Jonathan, or Dr. Jonathan Edwards right here. Jonathan Edwards was a very key figure in the First Great Awakening, especially because his sermons really emphasize a lot of these concepts right here. This idea of you can change your ways. You're not predestined to heaven or hell. You can either go to heaven, the opposite. You can either go to heaven or you can go to hell. Very emotional sermons, as we're going to see in a second. And also, he's a traveling minister. He goes from colony to colony, gathering massive crowds of followers who are going to listen to his extremely emotionally driven sermons. Probably the most important sermon that Jonathan Edwards gives, and kind of the reason why we talk about it, is that it sums up a lot of the characteristics of the First Great Awakening. And that sermon is called Sinners at the Hands of an Angry God. All of us are sinners. We were born in sin. We were born in sin, yes. However, you're not necessarily destined to go to heaven or to go to hell. Your actions matter. And if you don't come back to the correct way of doing things, I'm sorry, you're damned. You're going to hell. So Jonathan Edwards gives this very fiery sermon. It's something that people cry when they're listening to it. It's very, very emotionally driven. And that is, again, a characteristic of this First Great Awakening. But as I just mentioned, remember, kind of keep in the back of your mind for a second, these ministers are traveling up and down the 13 colonies, creating a sense of shared religious identity among the 13 colonies. All right, so let's continue actually and take a look at some of the reasons why both of these intellectual movements, the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening, why are they important in the context of our class? All right, so let's take a look at that importance right there. Well, the importance of the Enlightenment and its relation to future developments in American history is pretty obvious. Last year in World and Euro, kind of to summarize some of the early topics of more like semester two stuff, we saw that the Enlightenment is one of the philosophical causes of things like various political revolutions. And no doubt is that true in the Americas, in the American Revolution. Kind of the intellectual idea of constitutionalism, the intellectual idea of secularism, the idea of the intellectual concept of natural rights. These things are crucial in the language of the colonists who call for independence. Guys like Thomas Jefferson, guys like Benjamin Franklin, guys like John Adams, for example. And kind of this American version of the Enlightenment, one that focuses heavily on property rights and individualism, this is going to really define American political culture going forward. Americans highly value property. They are proprietors themselves, kind of using the idea of property ownership, that kind of definition of proprietor. Now, the First Great Awakening is a little less obvious. How is this important, and what does this lead to in terms of the future developments of this class? Well, the First Great Awakening is going to cause kind of a little bit of political and religious tension within the colonies as a whole. The colonies, they tend to be split up into the so-called Old Lights, Those are the traditional Puritans, and Anglicans, I should say, and the New Lights. These New Lights, actually, politically, they're going to embrace some of the radical ideas of independence, whereas some of the Old Lights are going to reject ideas like independence. So that'll become more important in Unit 2 as we get there later on. However, kind of the big thing to take away from the First Great Awakening is that much like the Enlightenment's focus on property and individualism, the First Great Awakening also introduces kind of the idea of, well, religion as a way to bind together various American colonies into one unified idea. Kind of the evangelism, the spread of Christianity from these traveling ministers, that's really going to be crucial in uniting the colonies, in at least the idea that culture and religion are not inseparable forces. What it means to be an American colonist and eventually American after independence is the idea of the focus on religion. Religion plays a valuable role in the lives of everyday people. Now, the First Great Awakening, much like its sister in the form of the Second Great Awakening, is also going to be focused on kind of, or at least it has some emphasis, some language on challenging older authorities, whether those authorities be political, mostly religious, but also social hierarchies as well. Some converts of the First Great Awakening are going to make it their duty to get rid of sin in the form of freeing their slaves. This was extremely rare, didn't happen that many times. However, that being said, it is laying the groundwork for religious explanations for and organization around religion for abolitionism, the opposition to the system of slavery. All right. Well, actually, that's everything that I wanted to talk about, and I'm ahead of schedule by 7 seconds, actually. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The worst sound ever. Go. All right. That haunts me in my dreams. Anyway, the sound, anyway, not the First Great Awakening. All right. Well, that was it for this video. I hope everything is going well in your lives. Please comment down below if you are if you're having a good day. If you're not, look up a picture of a platypus or some cute little animal. Look up a capybara. Those are cute. Look up if camels can swim. They can, by the way. Um, so don't look that up because I already told you the answer. Look up videos. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe what I'm saying is wrong. It's not, but maybe it is. Verify. Trust, but verify. That is a completely, that has, never mind. Okay. Well, that was it. Thank you so much. Have a great, excellent, wonderful day, and I'll see you around. Let us stop recording.